It was a bright sunny afternoon in downtown. The streets were filled with people going about their day, cars honking, and the distant sound of construction echoing between buildings. Families walked by, office workers hurried past, and a few tourists paused to take pictures of the city skyline. Everything seemed normal, calm, and ordinary. That calm was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. A group of police officers approached a man walking down the sidewalk. He seemed calm, almost unaware of the attention he was drawing. But the officers, tense and aggressive, were convinced he was resisting arrest. They surrounded him quickly, moving with the confidence of authority, not realizing the man they were confronting was no ordinary person. The man's face was calm, almost serene, but there was an undeniable intensity in his eyes. The officers didn't notice it. They saw only what they thought was a suspect, a person who should immediately comply. One officer stepped forward and grabbed him by the arm. Another moved to stand behind him, ready to use force if necessary. The crowd around them started to gather, sensing that something unusual was happening. Phones were pulled out, and whispers spread like wildfire. "What's going on? Who is that?" Suddenly, one of the officers moved too aggressively and attempted to choke the man, believing that this would force compliance. The man barely flinched. Instead, he remained calm, almost smiling faintly as if he already knew what was about to happen. The attempt to overpower him failed almost instantly. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning into shocked whispers. It was at that exact moment that recognition began to spread. Some onlookers' eyes widened. "No, it can't be," one whispered. Others started to pull out their phones faster, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The officers, still convinced they were in control, were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Because this wasn't just any man. This was Steven Seagal, a master of martial arts, a man whose calm demeanor hid decades of training and experience in hand-to-hand combat. And in that moment, the sunny afternoon in downtown became the scene of a silent showdown that would leave everyone stunned, humiliated, and in awe. The air seemed to thicken with tension as the officers realized, just a fraction too late, that they had underestimated him. Every move, every gesture, would now be under scrutiny. And what happened next? Well, no one in that crowd would ever forget it was a sunny afternoon, and downtown was alive with the usual bustle. People walked briskly along the sidewalks, some chatting on their phones, others carrying shopping bags. Street vendors shouted their daily specials, and the distant rumble of traffic filled the air. Amid all this ordinary activity, a scene was quietly unfolding that would soon turn the entire block upside down. Steven Seagal, calm and composed as always, was walking down the main avenue. He wore a simple outfit, plain jeans, a faded jacket, and sunglasses that hid most of his face. He moved slowly, without any bodyguards, without a hint of urgency, blending in with the crowd. To the casual observer, he was just another passerby enjoying a bright afternoon. But to anyone who knew him, or anyone about to meet him unexpectedly, there was a presence about him that demanded attention. As he walked, a group of police officers noticed him from a few feet away. They were tense and ready for trouble, though there was no clear reason for it. One officer nudged another, whispering, "That guy's acting suspicious. Maybe he's resisting." They decided to confront him. The officers approached, moving with authority and confidence, believing that compliance would come easily. One officer stepped forward and blocked Steven's path. "Sir, we need you to cooperate," he said, voice firm. Another officer circled behind him, ready to take action if necessary. The rest formed a loose perimeter, ensuring no one could interfere. Steven, however, remained calm. His movements were deliberate, slow, and precise. There was no panic in his eyes, no tension in his shoulders. He simply looked at the officers, his expression neutral, almost serene. The contrast was striking. The officers were tense, impatient, and loud, while he radiated complete control. The crowd began to notice the commotion. People paused in their tracks, some clutching their phones to record, others whispering among themselves. "Who is that?" someone asked. "Is he resisting arrest?" Another voice responded. The street, once alive with casual noise, grew quiet, as if the city itself had sensed that something unusual was unfolding. One officer, overconfident and convinced of his authority, stepped closer. He tried to grab Steven by the arm, thinking a firm hold would force compliance. But Steven did not react in fear or resistance. Instead, he simply shifted his weight, barely moving, and the grip loosened as if the officer's hands had passed through air. The officer frowned, confused. He tried again, harder this time, while another officer moved to assist. Steven's calm demeanor began to draw the attention of more bystanders. Phones were raised, people leaned over railings, and whispers turned into murmurs of disbelief. "Is that Steven Seagal?" someone asked in shock. Others shook their heads, thinking it couldn't be possible. And then it happened, the first real sign of what was coming. An officer attempted to use more force, reaching around Steven in an attempt to subdue him. Steven's body shifted smoothly, almost imperceptibly, and the officer stumbled forward, losing balance. The move was subtle but precise, a perfect display of martial arts mastery without aggression, without intimidation. The crowd gasped, realizing that this was no ordinary confrontation. Yet Steven did not strike, did not yell, and did not threaten. He simply stood there, calm and composed, letting the officer's confusion speak louder than any words could. It was as if he were silently saying, "You do not know who you are dealing with." Speech Balloon, here's a question for you. If you were standing in that crowd, watching this unfold, what would you do? Comment below. Would you stay calm or panic? The officers looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Their confidence, which had been absolute moments ago, began to waver. The street had gone quiet except for the faint sounds of phones recording and whispers spreading through the crowd. Every step, every gesture from Steven was deliberate, measured, and impossible to ignore. In that moment, it was clear that the ordinary, sunny afternoon had become anything but ordinary. The calm man in jeans and a jacket, who had walked unnoticed moments ago, was now the center of attention. Everyone watching could sense the tension, the anticipation, and the unspoken warning in his eyes. The officers were about to learn a lesson in humility, control, and respect, one that would leave a lasting impression on them and the entire crowd. And so, as the sun shone brightly over downtown, the stage was set. The confrontation was no longer about law or defiance. It was about awareness, mastery, and the silent power of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting his skills. What would happen next? Everyone waiting on that busy street was about to find out. The tension in the air was thick. The sunny afternoon now felt charged, every passerby holding their breath as the scene unfolded. Steven Seagal stood calmly in the middle of the street, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The officers, on the other hand, were tense, their confidence beginning to waver. They thought they were in control. They were very wrong. One officer, frustrated and desperate to assert authority, lunged forward to force Steven to the ground. His grip was firm, his face red with effort, but Steven barely flinched. In an instant, a subtle shift of weight, a barely noticeable movement, and the officer lost his balance. The crowd gasped. Phones flashed as people recorded the unbelievable sight. Another officer moved in to assist. He reached for Steven from the side, thinking that together they could overpower him. But Steven's movements were precise, controlled, almost effortless. A gentle twist of the wrist, a smooth shift of stance, and the officer stumbled, tripping slightly over the curb. No one was hurt. No one was attacked aggressively. Yet the message was clear. This man was no ordinary civilian. The crowd around them had grown larger. People leaned out of windows, paused on the sidewalks, and stopped their cars to watch. Some whispered, "Is that Steven Seagal?" Others shook their heads in disbelief. "It can't be," they said. But the unmistakable calm and confidence radiating from the man in jeans and a faded jacket left no doubt for those who knew. The officers were now visibly shaken. They had expected resistance, maybe a verbal argument, but not this level of control. Their attempts to assert dominance were failing one by one, and each failure was being witnessed by dozens of people. Humiliation was creeping in, slowly but surely. Steven, however, remained silent. He did not taunt, he did not threaten, and he did not show anger. Every movement he made was measured and deliberate, the result of decades of martial arts mastery. Even the smallest gestures carried authority without aggression. He was teaching without words, showing the officers the cost of arrogance and the power of calm precision. One officer tried again, this time with more force, grabbing Steven by the shoulders and trying to push him to the ground. But Steven shifted his weight, stepped lightly, and the officer stumbled forward again. This time, the crowd couldn't contain their reactions. Gasps, murmurs, and whispered excitement spread through the onlookers. Some people whispered, "He's too fast, too calm, it's impossible." A few brave bystanders approached, curious but cautious. They kept their distance, watching closely as Steven continued to control the situation without striking anyone. His calmness contrasted sharply with the officers' growing panic. They were losing face in front of the crowd, and Steven didn't even raise his voice. Speech balloon, pause for a moment and imagine yourself there. What would you do if you saw this unfold? Would you step back in awe, or would you dare try to intervene? Comment below, awe or panic. The officers began to communicate with each other in hurried whispers, realizing that their initial assumptions had been completely wrong. They had underestimated him. Every failed attempt to subdue him reinforced their confusion and embarrassment. The crowd's excitement grew, recording every angle, sharing every moment online almost instantly. And then it happened. One officer, finally grasping the truth, froze. Recognition dawned on him, and his grip loosened completely. "Wait, you're Steven Seagal," he stammered, his voice shaky. The realization spread like wildfire. The other officers paused, their faces reflecting the same shock. The street that had been tense with confrontation was now buzzing with whispers of awe and disbelief. Steven simply nodded, still calm, still composed. He did not gloat. He did not yell. He let the truth speak for itself. The officer's arrogance had been dismantled without violence, without anger, only with skill and presence. The lesson was delivered perfectly, and the entire crowd was witness. The sunny afternoon had shifted. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had transformed into a dramatic display of respect, mastery, and quiet power. The people who had been watching would not forget it, and the officers themselves would carry the memory as a humbling experience for years to come. Steven's calm gaze swept over the crowd one last time. The message was clear: strength does not need to shout. Power does not need to strike. And arrogance, when unchecked, can be the most dangerous weakness of all. The street had grown silent except for the faint hum of traffic in the distance and the occasional whisper from the growing crowd. What had started as a routine day in downtown had turned into a tense standoff. Steven Seagal stood in the middle of the street, calm and composed, while the officers around him fumbled to regain control. Each of their attempts only made it more obvious how outmatched they were. People had stopped walking, leaving cars to honk behind them, while others pressed against shop windows to get a better view. Phones were held high, recording every second of the confrontation. Some were streaming live, sharing the scene with viewers across the city. "This is insane," a bystander whispered. "I've never seen anything like it." The crowd's energy shifted from curiosity to a collective awe, silently cheering the man in jeans and a faded jacket who wasn't just defending himself but commanding respect through presence alone. The officers tried again, their voices sharp and commanding. "Step back. Step back now," one shouted. They moved in unison, attempting to corner him, but Steven's mastery of space and movement made it impossible. Every subtle shift of his weight, every calm step, disrupted their efforts. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, executed with absolute control. The officers stumbled, collided lightly, and occasionally turned to each other in disbelief. Their confidence, which had been their shield, was crumbling rapidly in plain view of the crowd. Steven's eyes scanned the area slowly. He didn't need to raise his voice. The calm authority in his gaze spoke volumes. The crowd instinctively leaned back, creating more space for him. Even the officers felt it, the invisible power of someone who had trained for decades to handle exactly these kinds of situations. The tension was almost tangible. Every onlooker could feel it, holding their breath as if the next moment could change everything. An officer tried a sudden grab from behind, thinking he might finally overpower the calm man. But Steven shifted, barely moving, and the officer stumbled again. His colleagues tried to help him, but the combined effort was still futile. No one could anticipate the subtle, precise movements of a martial arts master. The humiliation on their faces was growing with every failed attempt, and the crowd sensed it. People started whispering excitedly. "Look at him," one said. "He's too fast. He's untouchable." The energy in the street began to build. Some members of the crowd stepped forward, curious but cautious, while others instinctively stepped back, sensing the controlled intensity radiating from Steven. The tension wasn't aggressive, it was electric. People were caught in the drama of an unfolding lesson in humility, and every second was being recorded. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. At one point, one of the younger officers, frustrated and panicked, shouted, "You're under arrest. Cooperate." But Steven didn't move aggressively. He didn't need to. The mere presence of his calm, controlled demeanor was enough to make them question every decision they had made in the past few minutes. His movements were minimal but deliberate. The officers were no longer dictating the situation, they were reacting to it, stumbling over their own mistakes. Speech Balloon, here's a question for you. If you were watching this in person, would you step closer to see or stay back to avoid danger? Comment below. Step forward or stay safe. The crowd collectively held its breath as Steven slowly shifted, sidestepped, and created distance between himself and the officers. Every step was calculated, every pause meaningful. The officers were increasingly flustered, whispering urgently among themselves, realizing that their attempts to control him were futile. Some tried to regain authority, but the balance had shifted completely. By now, more and more people were recording, sharing the story, and watching in awe. The officers' aggression was dissolving, replaced with confusion and growing fear. They were learning a lesson in respect and control in front of dozens of witnesses, and the humiliation was only just beginning. As Steven stood there, calm, controlled, and completely aware of the energy around him, the stage was set for the next moment, the revelation that would turn this encounter from an ordinary confrontation into a legendary scene that no one would ever forget. The sunny downtown street had become a classroom, and the teacher was in complete command. The tension, the crowd, and the officer's embarrassment were all building to one inevitable truth. This was not going to end like any ordinary arrest. Something extraordinary was about to happen, and everyone present could feel it. The street had fallen into a tense silence. The officers, embarrassed and flustered, were trying to regain control, but the calm, commanding presence of Steven Seagal left them frozen. Bystanders watched in awe, phones raised, recording every moment. The sunny afternoon had transformed into a stage for a lesson in humility that no one would forget. Suddenly, one officer froze mid-step. Recognition flashed across his face. His mouth opened and closed, words failing him. "Wait, you're Steven Seagal," he stammered, disbelief in every syllable. The rest of the officers turned toward him, and their confusion spread like wildfire. Murmurs ran through the crowd. "Is that really him? No way, it can't be!" Some people gasped audibly, while others held their phones higher, trying to capture the moment. Steven, calm as ever, nodded slightly. His eyes scanned the street, observing the crowd, the officers, and the energy in the air. There was no anger, no aggression, only quiet authority. He didn't need to shout to assert control. His presence alone had done what words and force could not. The revelation had shifted the entire dynamic. The officers, who had tried to intimidate and control him, were now the ones exposed, humbled in front of everyone. At that moment, a black car rolled slowly to the curb. The doors opened, and three well-dressed executives stepped out, carrying folders and documents. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The officers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and panic. "Mr. Seagal, we've been waiting for you, sir," one of the executives called out, rushing toward him. The officers froze. Their faces drained of color. One whispered to another, He's the owner?" The realization hit them like a wave. Every move they had made in the past few minutes, every grab, every shove, every attempt to assert dominance, had been directed at the man who controlled the bank, the man whose reputation extended far beyond any uniform or badge. Steven smiled faintly, his calm demeanor unbroken. He reached out, shook hands with the executives, and glanced back at the officers. "I came here to make a simple deposit," he said, his voice measured, "but it seems I'll be making a few changes as well." The crowd erupted in whispers and murmurs. People stepped closer, some laughing in disbelief, others shaking their heads. Phones were everywhere, capturing the moment that was already going viral. The officers, still standing in shock, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Their arrogance and misjudgment had been exposed, and it was public. Speech Balloon, now it's your turn. If you were in that moment, What would you do? Comment below. Fire the officers or forgive them. Let's see who has the biggest heart. Steven's gaze returned to the officers. Respect is earned, he said simply. It's not about uniforms, authority, or threats. It's about character. His calm presence seemed to silence the murmurs of the crowd, focusing attention on the lesson being delivered. The officers lowered their heads, realizing the gravity of their actions, and the crowd watched, captivated by the unfolding drama. The executives handed him a folder with papers confirming his ownership, and Steven nodded, acknowledging the moment without drama. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he addressed the crowd. You've all witnessed a lesson today. Respect everyone, even when no one is watching. Arrogance blinds judgment, but humility opens eyes. The street seemed to hold its breath. Even the officers, embarrassed but wiser now, listened. The crowd murmured in agreement, some applauding quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Steven Seagal had turned what could have been a humiliating confrontation into a powerful teaching moment, and everyone there felt the weight of it. As the executives escorted him to the black car, the crowd followed, capturing every angle. The officers, still trying to process what had just happened, could do nothing but watch. The sunny afternoon had become unforgettable, a story that would be told and retold for years. Steven got into the car, giving one last calm glance at the street and the officers. The crowd cheered, phones raised high, capturing the moment for history. He had made his point without striking, without aggression, simply through presence, mastery, and quiet authority. The revelation was complete. The man they had tried to control was not only unshakable but also the one with the power to change everything. And with that, the stage was set for the final lessons in humility, respect, and the silent power of a true master. The black car doors closed behind Steven Seagal, yet the tension on the street lingered. The officers who had confronted him moments before were still standing frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Their uniforms, which had once given them authority, now felt like a burden. They had learned a lesson they would never forget: never underestimate someone, and never let arrogance cloud judgment. Steven, escorted by his executives, didn't speak loudly. His presence alone commanded attention, and every move he made communicated authority without aggression. The street around him was filled with stunned bystanders, phones raised high, capturing the surreal moment. Whispers spread like wildfire. That was incredible. I can't believe he didn't even fight back aggressively. He's untouchable. Meanwhile, the officers were left to process their actions. They had approached a man they believed was resisting, intending to assert control through force. But their attempts had been effortlessly countered by someone who had remained calm throughout. They had been humbled publicly, and the lesson was clear: strength is not in force or loudness, it is in control, skill, and composure. One officer, still shaking, muttered under his breath, "I can't believe we messed up like that." Another nodded silently, unable to find words. They had underestimated the calm man in jeans and a faded jacket, and the realization burned hotter than any reprimand could. Meanwhile, Steven turned briefly to the crowd, his calm gaze sweeping over them. He didn't need to speak, but when he did, it was measured, controlled, and perfectly timed. Respect is not just for the powerful. It is for everyone, he said quietly, yet his words resonated across the street. The crowd absorbed them instantly. This was not just about the officers. It was about a lesson everyone could carry into their lives. The executives handed him documents, and he acknowledged them with a nod. He glanced back at the officers once more. There was no malice in his eyes, only clarity and authority. He did not need to punish them. The lesson had already been learned. Yet, there was room for forgiveness, for redemption, for them to understand that respect was a two-way street. One of the older officers, who had remained composed throughout, finally stepped forward. "Sir, I'm sorry. We didn't know." His words trailed off, the weight of humility heavy in his voice. Steven nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without fanfare. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a transfer of wisdom from master to those who had almost made a mistake. The younger officers, watching silently, began to understand. They saw the calmness in Steven, the lack of aggression, and the controlled power. They realized that what they had interpreted as weakness or passivity was actually mastery, a mastery that rendered force unnecessary. Their faces showed a mix of relief and newfound respect. Speech Balloon, here's a question for you. If you were in that officer's place, would you apologize immediately or wait? Comment below, apologize or hesitate. As the sun continued to shine over downtown, Steven's executives guided him toward the car. He moved without urgency, perfectly aware of the attention he commanded, yet never seeking to dominate. The crowd watched, some applauding quietly, some still recording, and others simply staring in disbelief. What had been a tense confrontation had transformed into a demonstration of control, mastery, and dignity. The officers, though embarrassed, felt the impact of the moment. They had been humbled, but they had also witnessed the power of calm authority, the strength of silent mastery, and the importance of respect. It was a lesson they would carry with them far beyond that sunny afternoon. Steven paused for a brief moment, looking back at the street. His gaze met that of a few bystanders who had stayed calm, who had observed without judgment. It was a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Then, without a word, he stepped into the black car, and the doors closed. The car pulled away slowly, leaving the crowd, the street, and the officers behind. Yet the lesson remained. Arrogance had been exposed, respect had been commanded, and mastery had been demonstrated without a single aggressive act. The sunny downtown street, once ordinary, had become a scene of unforgettable clarity, a testament to the quiet power of presence, skill, and humility. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering stories of what they had just witnessed. Phones would replay the clips, conversations would retell the lesson, and the officers would carry the memory of this encounter for the rest of their careers. In that moment, it was clear, true authority does not need to shout. True respect does not demand fear. And true mastery is silent, yet impossible to ignore. Steven Seagal had walked away, but the lesson he left behind would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The sun was beginning its slow descent over downtown, casting long shadows across the streets where the events of the afternoon had unfolded. What had started as a routine, sunny day had transformed into an unforgettable lesson in humility, respect, and the power of quiet mastery. Steven Seagal had walked away from the confrontation with the officers, leaving behind not chaos, but clarity. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse slowly, still buzzing with excitement. Phones were raised, videos captured every angle, and the whispers of awe were almost palpable. People replayed the scene in their minds, astonished at what they had witnessed. A man, calm and unassuming, had faced aggression with composure and mastery, without striking unnecessarily or losing his cool. And in doing so, he had taught everyone present a lesson far more valuable than any lecture. Steven's departure left the officers humbled. They had entered the encounter with arrogance, certain that they held all the power. Yet they had underestimated someone whose strength was not measured by force but by skill, presence, and control. The embarrassment of the failed attempts to subdue him lingered, but with it came understanding, the realization that true authority does not need to shout, and true respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, quietly, patiently, and consistently. As the crowd began to return to their normal routines, the lesson remained in the air. Conversations erupted in coffee shops, offices, and sidewalks. "Did you see that?" one person would ask. "He didn't even attack, and they were all stumbling over themselves." "It's like he was teaching them a lesson without even touching them," another replied. The story would travel far beyond that street, shared across social media, replayed on videos, and remembered for years. Steven's calm walk into the black car had been more than a simple exit, it was a demonstration of restraint. His gaze had met those of the respectful bystanders, acknowledging them with a subtle nod, recognizing the importance of composure in the midst of chaos. His actions had shown that power is not in dominance but in control, that strength is measured not by how loudly you assert yourself but by how gracefully you respond to challenges. Speech Balloon, now it's your turn to reflect. When someone disrespects you, do you react with anger or respond with calm confidence? Comment below, anger or calm. The lesson extended far beyond the officers. It was a reminder for everyone watching that respect is universal. It does not depend on wealth, fame, or position. Every human interaction is an opportunity to show dignity and humility. Even when no one is watching, the way you treat others defines your character. And as the videos of this incident spread across the city and beyond, more people would learn this simple, yet profound truth. For the officers, the experience was transformative. Their arrogance had been dismantled in front of witnesses, their assumptions corrected, and their perspective forever altered. They had learned that force is temporary, but respect lasts a lifetime. That even someone appearing calm, unassuming, or ordinary could possess power far greater than expected, the kind that commands attention without intimidation. The sunny downtown streets were returning to their normal rhythm. Cars honked, pedestrians moved along, and life continued. Yet the memory of the day remained vivid. For those who had witnessed it, it would not fade. It would serve as a reminder that mastery, humility, and quiet authority are more impactful than noise, aggression, or arrogance. As Steven Seagal's car disappeared from view, the message was clear: true power is silent. True respect is earned, not demanded. And true strength is shown not in confrontation, but in composure under pressure. Those who witnessed it had been given more than entertainment. They had been given a lesson in character, presence, and the importance of humility. Speech balloon type respect in the comments if you believe humility and calm confidence are true strengths. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to recognize every person who values respect as much as Steven Seagal demonstrated today. The sunny afternoon had become a day to remember. What began as a confrontation had ended as a timeless lesson. And while the crowd dispersed, the impact remained, in the officers who had been humbled, in the bystanders who had witnessed mastery firsthand, and in the thousands who would watch the videos and learn from the quiet, commanding presence of a true master. Respect is not given because someone is powerful. Respect is given because one chooses to act with dignity, patience, and awareness. That was the lesson of the day, and one that would echo far beyond downtown, beyond the officers, beyond anyone who had simply walked by. The lesson was clear. Presence speaks louder than words, mastery is shown through calm control, and humility is the true measure of strength. Steven Seagal had left the street, but the echo of his example would linger forever.